going to start by telling you a story about two little boys who are not related to each other, but both have autism. This first little boy would be diagnosed with autism at a children's hospital about 5 miles from his home. And the other little boy would have to endure a 5-hour drive to a children's hospital for that same diagnosis. Both of these little boys have parents with nagging feelings that something wasn't quite right with their son's behavior. Vacant stares, missed developmental milestones, no highs or byes, no mamas or dadas. And the first little boy would come back with that diagnosis and receive years of in-home speech and occupational therapies. And the other little boy would have to wait until he entered public preschool for those same services. But let's back up a moment, make sure we're on the same page when you hear the word autism. My guess is that you don't need me to tell you very much about autism, that your life has probably in some way already been affected by autism. Maybe you have a friend with a son or a daughter. Maybe you have a classmate with autism. And at the very least, if you're 40 and over, you've probably seen the movie Rain Man, where most of us heard the word autism for the first time. So this is not news anymore. We've heard about the increased rate of autism, now 1 in 68 children. The controversy over vaccines, the call for more research, maybe the changing criteria for diagnosing autism. So we've become more educated. And on the surface, we know a couple things. One, that autism is a spectrum disorder, meaning there are some with high-functioning forms of autism and others with a more severe form of the disability, usually marked by someone with an intellectual disability or maybe someone who's completely nonverbal. And that within that spectrum, there are varying degrees of difficulty associated with 3 characteristics of autism: social interaction, communication, and repetitive behaviors. And then it goes from there. There are lots of concepts and nuanced vocabulary words associated with autism: stimming, idiosyncratic language, echolalia, sensory defensiveness. This list goes on and on. And most of us come to know these words and what they mean on a need-to-know basis. So set that aside for just a second. And I'm going to ask you to think about another concept you also know a lot about, and that's rural. By the very nature that you're here tonight in Southwest Virginia, in the foothills of Appalachia, you can at least call to mind these bucolic and agrarian images that most of us associate with the word rural. And like autism, there are 3 defining characteristics about rural. And the first is geographic isolation, where that rural community is located in relation to a suburban or urban area. The second is population density, how many people live in that rural community. So you have places that are considered rural remote, that are far away and have fewer than 2,500 people, and then you have places that are considered rural fringe areas. So rural communities, let's say outside of Roanoke, that might have as many as 25,000. So like autism, there's a spectrum for understanding what rural is. And we know some things about rural communities: the decline of the family farm over the last several decades, a shift from goods to services that has resulted in more part-time wages and fewer benefits for families. We know that people struggle in rural areas. And so now what I want you to do is put those 2 ideas together. And maybe that's something that you haven't thought about before: what autism looks like in a rural community. In a rural community that might be geographically isolated, that might be so sparsely populated that they lack human resources to provide diagnoses and interventions. So why do we lack a schema for understanding what rural autism might look like? Maybe rural is simply out of sight and out of mind, so that we don't ask questions about students with autism who might be living below the poverty line, who might be on free and reduced lunch, who might be in a community that is completely lacking internet access, or with parents who've never been outside of that rural community. Because that third criteria of rural is poverty. So not all rural communities, but far too many are areas of economic depression. So I care about this because I am born and bred country. I grew up in a 1-stoplight town surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains. These are some images of my great-grandparents, and there I am at a chicken barbecue with my cousin Bubba in the background. So rural is a place that I care a lot about. It's a deeply ingrained value. But when I left this rural community, I was called a redneck. I was told that I talk funny, that there are no Z's in greasy, and that polecats are just skunks everywhere else. In fact, I was in college when I saw venison on the menu, and I asked a server what that was and found out that deer meat had this really sophisticated name out here in the world. So because of my experiences, I know that rural can be misunderstood or ignored, or worse yet, belittled and made fun of. So I don't have rose-colored glasses when it comes to looking at the challenges in rural areas. And in the other topic that I'm really concerned about with autism, that world opened up to me in October of 2008 when my son was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. He's the little boy at the beginning of this talk, the one who was diagnosed just 5 miles from his home. Classic textbook autism is what the developmental pediatrician told us. And after several hours of evaluations and assessments, we took home a very scared and nonverbal little boy with a lot of booklets, pamphlets, instructional booklets about what to do now that you have this diagnosis. And let me tell you, waiting for that diagnosis is like waiting for a storm that's been forecasted for days and days. You take all of the precautions needed, but you're still not prepared when that word hits, because autism can rock your world. And just thinking back to those days, they're still some of the very toughest of my life. The fear and grief of not knowing what the future might look like for your child, it's terrifying. So in the last 8 years, I've had to become an expert on a lot of those big autism vocabulary words. Floor time and ABA therapies, speech and occupational therapies, special education and IEP meetings. All the while trying to figure out how I could get my son to endure a haircut, how we could walk into a grocery store without him having a meltdown, how he could attend school or go to school on a bus or sleep at night, which seemed impossible. And as I begged every day to learn to say, "I love you, Mommy." So that was an all-consuming experience. And for as fantastic as it was, it's really quite common for autism parents, that education and grief and fear, the scrambling for resources. So I think about how much harder that must be for someone who has no access to the answers. So I come to you tonight as a rural scholar on one hand and as a mom, an advocate on the other. And I know that I'm terribly flawed with bias in this area. But here's what I do know. That living in a rural community doesn't mean that you love your child with autism any less. Living in rural poverty doesn't mean that you don't want to advocate for your child with autism. But it might mean that you lack the know-how or the expertise and the ways that you can do that effectively. So I've been doing a lot of research in this area, working in remote rural communities to find out what are the experiences for the people living there. And I met a woman who told me about getting her son that diagnosis. And that's the other little boy in this opening talk. And she told me that that was a 5-hour drive in one direction to the closest hospital, and that she too came home with all of those instructional booklets and pamphlets, and then what? She said that in her rural community, there were no resources for her. And other parents had similar stories, and they talked about how the schools were their only resource. These were the ruralities that these people described to me. And yet when I talked to the general education and special education teachers, they explained that the schools were really ill-equipped to deal with the unique needs of children with autism outside of their special education setting. I spoke to a principal who explained that rural schools often lack funding to provide the needed professional development to those general education teachers. And still other people told me about the complete lack of internet access, and that only those who could afford a $60 a month bill could get phone service, a 3G service, which was spotty at best. So now what? It's not enough just to tell you about this challenge. Tonight is all about sparking creativity and interest and maybe brainstorming some solutions around these problems. So at the Virginia Tech Center for Autism Research, we're spending a lot of time thinking about how we might be a center of excellence in dealing with the unique challenges of autism in rural areas, particularly here in Appalachia. We are right now applying for a grant that would allow us to go into the most remote rural regions to assess the barriers and facilitators for early diagnosis and the related services, and maybe to develop some place-based services that would meet the unique needs of the people living there. We've started the SAFE program, the Supporting Autism Friendly Environments, which is a community-based program right here in the New River Valley that's to increase access and inclusion for individuals with autism. We're also working on a mobile autism unit. So imagine an RV that would drive into rural areas to provide those families with access that they're now missing. I'm not for sure what we can do, but I know that we have to do more. My son now tells me every night that he loves me. He rides to school on the big bus, and he sleeps like an angel at night. I'm so grateful for that. I know that we can't necessarily build hospitals in these rural areas. I know that we can't necessarily throw money at problems at schools, but we can do a better job advocating for unseen communities. We can develop a place framework in our conversations about rural and about autism, thinking of ways we can develop place-based interventions, how we might leverage access, advocate for those unseen communities, and communicate in ways with rural communities that don't overly rely on the internet. And finally, educate others about these ruralities, these special considerations. Because I know that those folks in rural communities, it's not enough to just have this Pollyanna view and to say it's okay that they're marginalized in ways that others aren't. Those early interventions are critical. They make all the difference in someone's life. And I know that those parents in those remote rural communities want just as much for their children as I want for mine. Thank you.